Hi and welcome back. This is Kelly Allen, and I'm continuing my reading from the book, The Puzzle, A Gift from Spirit. In this video, I'll be reading the section that I've titled A Collection of Stories, Thoughts, and Inspirations. The following chapters and pages are a collection of stories, thoughts, and inspirations that I feel compelled to share in the spirit of truth, brotherhood, compassion, and love. I hope they touch your soul as much as they touched mine when Spirit inspired me to write them. As always, I start with a quote, and the quote I will read today is from Hebrews 13:2, of course in the Bible, and the quote is, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." The catalyst or angel in disguise. I had a difficult time deciding on a title for this particular chapter, so I decided to give it two. Either title effectively captures the events of this story. You see, I was sent an angel in disguise, which was a catalyst in opening my eyes and returning me to the path of seeking, and back to the puzzle I had abandoned in my belief that I had obtained the understanding I needed to grasp the meaning of the puzzle of life. This was a path that would find truth, brotherhood, compassion, and love guiding me, inspiring me, teaching me, and opening my spiritual eyes, ears, mind, and heart to greater understanding. Having found and become solidly rooted in a fundamentalist church, I believed I had found the ultimate, quote, truth of the very nature of God, God's purpose for humanity, and my personal mission to share this, quote, gospel of salvation. I use quotations in my message because I would later come to realize that the very message I held to with my entire mind and might was actually one of exclusivity, divisiveness, and intolerance. This message, although at times shared with good motivation and intention, was not inspired by truth, brotherhood, compassion, and love. As a fervent member of the, quote, church, I held to the belief that not only were all non-Christian beliefs a form of paganism and false teaching, but all Christian churches outside the church organization I now belong to were also following teachings of heresy. Anyone outside the teachings of our church, which again included the majority of other, quote, Christians and non-Christians alike, was doomed to an eternity of damnation and suffering in hell. Believe me, I look back on those years of my life and I wonder how I could have swallowed such a message and wholeheartedly believed it, but I did. For approximately 4 years of my life, I became one of the most dedicated members of my newfound, quote, truth. I was one of the most assertive and aggressive advocates of this, quote, gospel in the church, and was on a mission to proselytize anywhere and everywhere I could, including work, high school, and anywhere else I happened to be. I would stand on the street corners of Carlsbad, California in the summertime and preach to the locals and tourists alike. I even joined a group of members from around the country at the 1984 World Olympics in Los Angeles and spent several days sleeping in an area church basement so that we could hit the streets during the day and evangelize the message of, quote, truth to the masses. In my daily life, everyone I encountered was an opportunity for me to, quote, save another individual from the fiery pits of hell. I took this mission very seriously, and I sincerely wanted to see as many people as possible join me in heaven in the afterlife. Of course, I was taught and came to believe that there would only be a small, select, chosen few who would listen and heed the call, and for those refusing to hear, it was their choice and therefore their responsibility for missing out on heaven and suffering an eternity in hell. It was our mission to preach this, quote, gospel to all, but the church taught us that most would reject it. It was only our duty to give them the opportunity so they could be held accountable at Judgment Day. This was a hard concept for me to grasp, but with repetition and good old-fashioned God-fearing submission, I resolved to do my best to at least try to aid everyone I possibly could in gaining the opportunity to choose. As the years passed, I learned to become complacent in my beliefs. I somehow managed to grow comfortably numb. I had slowly allowed my burning passion for truth and understanding to wither, believing I had found the answers I sought, and now replaced my obsession with learning and growing with that of recruiting and saving. In the church, questions that didn't support the teachings of the church were met with public accusations of demonstrated doubt and lack of faith, whereas efforts to support the teachings and to make converts would result in public praise. In retrospect, I realized that I was one of the greatest contributors to the growth of the membership in the local assembly. However, it took divine intervention for me to wake up and realize that my motivation had become more self-centered in pride and approval, and less driven by a sincere desire to help others escape their pending damnation. I had become a good soldier in the war to defend truth. I must admit that over the term of my membership in the church, I would on occasion have moments of doubt about the beliefs. Of course, as a well-programmed member, I would immediately dismiss these thoughts as fiery darts of the wicked one, quote, and the devil's attempt to pull me astray. These doubtful thoughts, should I entertain them, could easily lead to being turned over to a reprobate mind by God, and therefore losing the ability to ever regain my now lost salvation. I had become a good standing member of the, quote, true church, behaving like a great member should, doing my best to seek out and convert the chosen few who, like me, were predestined to be saved, but lost in a sea of heathens. It took, dare I say it, an act of God to save me from this predicament and teaching, and get me back on the path of learning, growing, and best of all, understanding. On Wednesday nights during Bible study, I was usually found serving in an usher role. In this role, I not only helped distribute songbooks and offering plates, but I stood ready to participate in prayers for members of the congregation who requested an intervention to help them ward off the attacks of the devil, prayers for healing, etc. Of course, as an usher, I also stood guard to prevent riffraff from coming in. The Wednesday night services were typically for members only, and with the wave of a finger or the raise of an eyebrow, the pastor could quickly have me request an uninvited guest to leave and return on a Sunday. One Wednesday, while attending an evening Bible study, another church brother and I were standing in our positions at either side of the assembly door as ushers. On this particular night, the pastor was teaching on the topic of capital punishment. I'm assuming this was probably a hot topic of discussion at the time, but as a church member, we wouldn't know, as we were prohibited from watching TV or reading newspapers. These were, after all, tools of the devil to promote false teachings and heathen propaganda. Using primarily Old Testament scripture, the pastor elaborated on why we as, quote, Christian bearers of the truth should believe in capital punishment. During this teaching, a gentleman had come through the door. This individual was quite disheveled and with very dirty and worn out clothes. Upon entering the assembly building, the other usher and I both looked to the pastor for his guidance. To this day, I wonder why the pastor didn't give the nod to have this individual removed immediately. Perhaps he thought this man was an easy target for conversion, or perhaps he just wanted to wait and allow the time for the dramatic events to follow. As this gentleman took a seat in the pew, the pastor continued with his lesson on capital punishment. My concentration was now distracted, and I found myself paying more attention to this gentleman than I did to the pastor and the teaching. I watched as this man leaned forward at times, appearing to be grossly interested in the subject matter. Sometimes he would fidget and look around, look back at me, and then he would redirect his attention back to the pastor. On the occasions that this gentleman's eyes would make contact with mine, in spite of the wild hair and beard and the dirt all over his face and his disheveled clothing, there was something about his eyes that touched me deeply. It was as if he was able, with a glance, to reawaken my compassion for my fellow human being in a way that transcended any teaching or dogma. As a person with an older brother who was a Vietnam veteran, and being familiar with how many homeless were also vets, I wondered if he too had suffered the atrocities of that war. Maybe this connection aided my reopening of the door of compassion for me. I can only surmise. At any rate, it was as if my need to know and understand this individual now consumed me, as once did my passion and my passionate search for truth. As the pastor went on with the lesson, the gentleman raised his hand in an effort to be acknowledged. The pastor ignored his gesture and continued with his studies, although I was extremely focused on watching this man's actions, so that I may have missed a gesture or a look from the pastor to suggest the man be dealt with and removed. I do recall noting the volume level of the pastor's voice raising and reflecting an all too familiar tone of fervor mixed with anger. I was mesmerized as this visitor continued to lean forward in earnest listening, look around the room, and again look back at me. It was as if he was communicating with me on a level that only I was aware of. But with each glance, my yearning to speak to this man grew with intensity. Looking back, I now know that he was there not to receive a message, but to offer one. And wow, what a message he would deliver. Side note, reading this out loud is having an emotional impact on me, and I'm going to power through this and get through it, but I remember it like it was yesterday. So, back to the reading. This gentleman tried raising his hand a couple of times and ultimately began waving his hand in an effort to get the pastor's attention. When his efforts went unheeded, he finally stood up, and in the most kind and gentle voice you can imagine, he said, "Excuse me, can I ask a question?" It was at this point the pastor called on the ushers, the other brother and me, to escort this man out of the building. He announced that the devil himself had come into our presence and was attempting to disrupt us. I'm not sure if the other usher had missed the silent clues of the pastor as well, and this is why the gentleman was allowed to stay in our midst for as long as he did. But when the pastor made the call, the other usher, who I'll call Brother Ed, immediately made his way to this man, grabbed him by the arm, and requested he come with him. I didn't move. It was as if I was outside of myself watching the events unfold. The man again requested to be allowed to ask a question, to which the pastor responded by insisting the man leave. At this point, Brother, quote, Ed, who came to the church with an incredible background in martial arts, put this man's arm up behind his back and marched him out of the church like a common criminal. I couldn't believe my eyes and my heart sank. I could hear the verbal prayers of the church members beginning to increase in volume, in both English and in tongues. Without hesitation, I now stood up and followed Brother Ed and the visitor out the church door with no particular intent other than with the knowing I had to talk to this man. Even as I write this account, I find that my heart feels like it did the very day it happened. Just as in the few occasions when I have recounted this story verbally, I am charged by electricity producing goosebumps all over my body, and my heart feels like it could burst. There is a feeling that consumes the pit of my stomach, which erupts with a depth of sorrow and compassion that is matched with inexplicable joy. My throat wells up now, as it has in the past, when I have shared this story, and the tears of sorrow and joy flow. It is a contradiction that is difficult to put into words, but a feeling that I've learned to recognize as spirit or God. But I digress. Once outside, I followed as Brother Ed directed the gentleman to the side of the building and instructed him to be on his way. I looked at Ed as he passed me, and I could detect the feeling of satisfaction he held in knowing that he would return to the congregation with pride in having defended his brothers and sisters from this intruder who the pastor had discerned to be not just unworthy of our presence, but the enemy himself. There would be accolades for Brother Ed. He had successfully taken on this threat and demonstrated his loyalty to the church, the pastor, and to God. As I made the corner of the church building, I saw the man standing there. His back was to me, but he had stopped walking. It was as if he was waiting for me. Before I could overthink the situation, I intuitively said to this man, "I am so sorry for what just happened. I can assure you that my brothers and sisters mean well, and they believe they are doing what is best. If you still want to ask, I'm willing to listen to your question." Although the question wasn't too surprising to me, what came with the question was, the gentleman turned around to face me. When our eyes connected, I felt like he shared the same... I'm sorry. This is a powerful experience, as you can tell. It definitely has an impact on me. I'll back up. Although the question wasn't too surprising to me, what came with the question was, the gentleman turned around to face me. When our eyes connected, I felt like he shared the same compassion for me that I was feeling for him. He went on to explain to me that he did in fact serve in Vietnam, and in doing so he was required to shoot and kill in response to direct orders from his superiors. The question he had wanted to ask was simply this: can God forgive me for having taken lives? This poor soul just sat in on a teaching about the death penalty, where the pastor taught that if you kill, you should be killed. Worse than that, when he tried to ask a question, he was escorted out with brute force. My heart was already crying out to God. Oh, forgive me. I'm trying to hold it together. My heart was already crying out to God when I made my way out of the church. I was praying for the right words and for the right actions. Thank heaven, my prayers were answered. Without hesitation, I began to share with this gentleman the story of the Apostle Paul. You see, in case you aren't familiar with the life and the background of the Apostle Paul, he was originally named Saul. Saul was a religious zealot who fervently rebuffed the teachings of the followers of Christ. As a matter of fact, according to his own testimony, Paul, then Saul, violently persecuted, quote, the Church of God, followers of Jesus, prior to his conversion to Christianity. Saul was a Pharisee, a high religious ruler of the day. He was the son of a Pharisee and was advancing in stature with Judaism's Jerusalem temple leadership before he came to believe in the teachings of Jesus. Even the Bible states that Saul was breathing threat and murder against the disciples of the Lord, and he went to the high priest to get letters allowing him to bring bound to Jerusalem anyone who was a Christian, and that's found in Acts 9:1-2. Also, I had shared the story of Saul and his background. Once I had shared the story of Saul and his background, I went on to share with him the story of Saul's conversion by God as he traveled on the road to Damascus. I explained how God had changed Saul's name to Paul, and how Paul went on to be one of the most notable apostles who wrote the majority of the New Testament, including some of the various scriptures read by the pastor to defend capital punishment. As I was sharing Paul's account and the story of his conversion, I caught glimpses of a gleam in this gentle man's eyes. It hadn't struck me quite yet exactly what was taking place, but I couldn't fight the feeling that he was there for me as much as I thought I was there for him. I concluded with these words that just about got stuck in my throat as I said them. I advised this man to, quote, find a good loving church. These words would change the course of my life and derail my current path more than I could ever have imagined when I said them. As I spoke these words, a realization flooded my soul, and I knew that there was no turning back. In those few words, find a good, loving church. I had just committed what would be considered the greatest heresy of all in the eyes of the, quote, true church. I had just sent someone astray. Of course, my programmed mind began to work on me right away. If he was brought by the devil, as the pastor had indicated, there was no loss, right? But what was the feeling I got when I looked in this man's eyes? Why had I lost the sense of compassion I once felt so strongly when I set out on my search for truth so early in my life? Why did my understanding of the scriptures contradict the pastor's? No matter how confused I felt, I could not dismiss what had taken place. Not then, not ever. Little did I know the miracle I had prayed for often and seemingly so long ago had just arrived. For now, it was time to head back into the church and face the music. I couldn't lie about what just happened. Maybe the pastor won't ask for specifics, I thought. I could only hope. As I made my way back inside, the pastor paused from the lesson he had now resumed. I could see by his face that he had already made a judgment about my absence while I was outside with the, quote, enemy. He openly rebuked me for having chased after demons and instructed me to stay behind at the end of the study so that he could speak with me one-on-one. I was glad that the night's study would soon be ending. I could hardly stand the pastor's disappointment in me, and waiting for foreboding discipline was dreadful. The evening ended with the usual confirmations between members with praise on the evening's teachings. Conversations spoken loudly enough by church members for the pastor to hear included regurgitation of the just delivered message and served as public affirmation of compliance with the teachings. Discussions of the intentional distractions sent in by the devil were, of course, included. I had never before realized how transparent we were as a church in our efforts to please our leader. It was as if the veil had been dropped from my eyes and I was beginning to see clearly. When the time finally came, I approached the pastor on the church platform. The rest of the congregation was gone or outside. The pastor once again rebuked me for chasing devils. I tried to get him to allow me to share the man's story and the question he wanted to ask, but the pastor refused to hear. He informed me that the devil will come in many disguises, and I had just fallen for one of them. He went on to tell me that I was to now be on probation. I could no longer speak to another brother or sister in the church unless there were at least two of them present. He also removed me from all duties, which included my role as an usher and preaching at the Friday night youth group meetings. I was to sit on the front row of each and every church meeting until further notice, and he would let me know when probation had ended. Interestingly enough, had I been given this type of instruction prior to the visit from this mysterious veteran that night, I would have complied without question. I would have assumed that the pastor, as the shepherd of our flock, knew what was best for me and was only looking out for my best interest. Now I only wondered if he sincerely thought he was looking out for us or if control was the primary agenda. It became all too apparent to me that we were indeed sheep and we were allowing ourselves to be herded. But from that day forward, I was only able to see insecurity and fear in this church, where there should be peace of mind, and judgment, where there should be compassion, grace, and love. Not even 2 weeks of compliance with the restrictions placed upon me had gone by before I was compelled to once again approach the pastor with an attempt to share with him the conversation I had with the Vietnam vet. I pressed the issue and made him listen. I could see the pastor's anger rise as I spoke. I was no longer in submission, and this upset him terribly. I wanted to bring up the story of Saul and his conversion. I wanted to elaborate on how I told the gentleman that day to find a good, loving church. There was no room for discussion, only further rebuke. The pastor informed me that I would need to apologize to not just him, but the entire congregation for my lack of obedience and the potential harm I was exposing them to. I told the pastor that I felt it was best if I depart from the church and went on my own way. The pastor, of course, reminded me that I was on my way to becoming reprobate and losing my salvation with no hope of regaining it. For the first time in years, with peace in my heart, I made the decision to leave. All these years later, I reflect back on my experience in this fundamentalist church. I don't regret the experience, for I learned incredibly from it. It also laid the foundation for me to have one of the most profound experiences in my lifetime, my encounter with the Vietnam vet. I often wonder why I never asked this gentleman for his name. Not that it would have mattered, for you see, it was years later in my experience with the Sikh teacher and the lessons of the puzzle that I came to realize that the teacher who visited me shared the same eyes as the Vietnam vet I had encountered all those years prior in this fundamentalist church. His name was Truth. Brotherhood, compassion, understanding, and love.